Well, welcome everyone and greetings from the Warburg Institute. Today's Renaissance life is the life of the German-Flemish painter Hans Memling, who was born in the 1430s, between 1430 and 1440, and died in 1494. Memling is really a German émigré who set up a very bustling painting workshop in Bruges, which at the time was Europe's main commercial hub. And there he prospered thanks to the patronage of the various members of the national merchant communities, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Genoese, the Florentine, some of whom will you see be some of the division of today's conversation. Because this means that throughout his career, Memling adapted to the taste of his patrons. So on one hand, he absorbed European style, but also thanks to the itinerant life of his merchant patron, his style was disseminated throughout Europe and had particular influence, especially in Italy. So, to explore how the life of a painter crossed the lives of many European merchants and to look at the visual outcome of this encounter, I am joined by the author of the book you see on the screen, Memling and the Merchant. The author is Mitzi Kirkland-Ives, who is professor of art history and visual culture at Missouri State University and a specialist in early modern European art. She has published, among other things, on Memling, as well as on other subjects related to the Northern Renaissance. And I am equally joined by Rembrandt Duits, Deputy Curator of the Photographic Collection of the Warburg Institute, who is an expert on the Renaissance material world, on hell, and also architect of the Warburg Iconographic Database. And we thought we would begin, I believe, Rembrandt, with talking about the scene of Memling life, that is Bruges.
Yes, well, thank you, Francois. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome, Mitzi. It'll be a pleasure to talk to you today. I've really enjoyed reading your book.
Thanks you for organizing this. This is exciting.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me about the book, indeed, as Francois hinted at, is that the big role of Bruges that is played in the book, somewhat unusually for an art history monograph, almost like you could say that in James Joyce's Ulysses, Dublin is a character. For you, Bruges is a character in your book. It has a whole chapter to itself. So can you say a little bit more about why that is, why you chose to this approach, and about Bruges?
Exactly. I think as a character, that's interesting. I think that part of this was that it was a bit of a COVID project in this time in 2020, 2021, where we were getting tired of making sourdough bread and repainting walls of our homes or something. I'd done a bit of work on Memling in the past, but with a life of the mind sort of focus, so devotional and intellectual context. And I think during the pandemic, something about place and space and a kind of the concrete situation that the person lives in was starting to feel more and more vital in some way. And also I had been having a look at some of the social history. On the one hand, for a course, I was looking at some of the social histories of art for the 19th and 20th centuries and 18th century approaches, but also the works on Flanders and on Bruges by people like Jan de Molen and Jelle Hammers, and some of that very interesting social history of this same time period. And I looked at this and I want to work on that. And plus just the space of Bruges, it's so compelling. You're dropped in there, especially as an American, and all of our old cities are not terribly old, at this relatively well-preserved site. But to even consider some of the aspects of it that aren't so well conserved, some of the streets that used to be streets and now they're or they used to be canals and now they're parking lots, or there used to be a cathedral here and now there's something else there entirely. But that some of just the urban fabric and the history of the site itself is still visible to a far greater extent. So just space, I think, was where I was coming from in there.
But you also talk, indeed, as Francois hinted at, a lot about the very diverse and international population that the city had, much more so than possibly any other city in that corner of the continent.
I think that's true. And it was a bit of a Singapore or Hong Kong of its century, I think. And we'll see the same sort of thing with Antwerp and Amsterdam in some later centuries, but maybe only in terms of Europe, maybe only rivaled by Venice, perhaps at the same time, or Florence, perhaps. But the international community there, yes. So a pretty significant number of merchants, especially, and bankers making families. So as you said, various Italian nations like the Florentines, the Genoese, the Venetians a bit. Who else is there? Bologna. We know that there's at least one, probably Bolognese family among Memling's clientele, but also the Hansa up in what's now northern Germany, off into Estonia, for example, Castile, some other of the Spanish kingdoms, possibly some patronage from different parts of France, at least one. I suppose we'd call him a Welshman, but somebody from the British Islands is also represented in the clientele. And so in Bruges, in terms of a commercial city at the time period, and primarily a commercial city, it was not a major court hub. It had a very active ecclesiastical community, but it wasn't a major cathedral center. It wasn't, the seat of an archbishop or anything like this. And really that the merchants were driving this artistic activity that's happening there. It's
Yes,
something a little bit distinctive there. And that
it was really a city of markets and shops.
Yeah, and it comes up as a commercial site, and not primarily even as a manufacturing site. It's almost like a warehouse distribution center. So sort of like Redmond, Washington or something like that, or wherever Amazon has its big headquarters.
Well, maybe we should start looking at some of, because one thing that is interesting about Memling in particular is that I think more than any of the other Netherlandish imported artists before him in and around Bruges, he really worked for this international community. And I think we'll start with some of the works that he did for Italian patrons, partly because it was one Italian patron that I think gave him one of his first big and important commissions that we see on the screen here, which is also a painting with a very interesting history, I think.
This one is fascinating. Yes, you speak of Agnolo Tani. So he is Florentine, and for some time, probably some years before Memling appears on the scene, even he had been the chief of the Bruges branch of the Medici Bank, so this major Florentine banking empire, of course. And so he had been the chief of the branch, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
They also had a branch in London active for some time. And something happens and he's ousted eventually. And after that point in 1465, Tommaso Portinari here takes over the leadership of the branch, but Tani continues to commission this triptych, which this would have been very early in Memling's career in Bruges. Before he arrives in Bruges, we don't know much about what he's up to. And something this big, this flashy, perhaps it has something to do with commemorating a marriage. It depends on precisely what date this can be tied to, but it was almost certainly not intended to remain in Bruges. It was probably intended to go to a family chapel outside of Florence at the Badia da Fiesole, into a
Yes.
chapel there.
A chapel dedicated to Saint Michael, I believe.
Right, who we see right at the center of the center panel here, weighing souls. And it's notable in that it's a triptych, which would have been a little bit novel still in Italy at this time, a format that the painters in Flanders were still working quite a bit with. And oil paint would have still been somewhat novel down in Italy. We do know that they had a real appetite for this. There's something, of course, they're commissioning many works from Italian artists, but there's some kind of a taste for the Florentine, or sorry, for the Flemish painting, for the early Netherlandish painting at the moment. Perhaps it says something about their international ambitions and their business acumen and their internationality, or something like that. There seems to be some kind of status building aspect to commissioning these panels from people up north to begin with. But just the fact that it's so gorgeous is notable. And this really would have cemented Memling's reputation, I think, in Florence, or in Bruges. He hasn't been there for too many years at this moment. So maybe his second or third year in the city, as far as we can tell. But in terms of Memling, his biography, and as we were saying, the place, that's part of the trick of a biography of somebody in the 15th century, is that, it was like, we want this to have a biographical aspect, so have Memling's biography in there. It's like, we know shreds about his life, tiny indicators, little bits of evidence. Otherwise, a lot of it, you have to write around the personality in context, because there are so few archival traces, which seems a bit perverse, because we have these fantastic material cultural objects right in front of our faces, and there's no denying that this personality existed and created these amazing objects. But the secondary documentation about his life is so partial.
One thing we do know about this painting was that it was actually captured by pirates, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Which is why it's now in Gdansk rather than in Florence.
Yeah, and some other authors have written about this quite a bit. Right, so it seems to have been painted for Tani, and sometime before it was shipped from Bruges, somehow Tommaso Portinari manages to insert himself into the commission in some way. We see that if you could look at the scales there of that St. Michael is holding, the personality kneeling there in this praying gesture, that's actually a portrait of Tommaso Portinari. We know this because he shows up on Hugo van der Goes's Portinari altarpiece that's in the Uffizi now as well. This is inexplicable because, or maybe not inexplicable, we can't quite explain it yet. I'm sure that there might be some information that comes out soon, but his portrait has been added after the fact. It's been painted on a piece of tin foil and then pasted on over the finished work here. So some technical analysis has revealed some details about this. So he gets into this commission somehow, and at the time that the work is shipped finally, it's one of two altarpieces that's on a galley shipment that was, it seems to have been primarily funded by Tommaso Portinari and some other Florentines and destined for Italy. And it was a galley that belonged to a fleet of ships that had been built by the Duke of Burgundy. And Portinari is leasing this as a business venture, essentially, like a kind of a venture fleet. And just after they leave the coast, yes, it's taken by this Hansa pirate who just takes the entire shipment. And Portinari and other merchants in Florence, in Bruges, appeal to the Duke, they appeal to the Pope. The Medici, of course, get involved trying to secure this. The Hansa explain that this is a legitimate act of war, that this is privateering because of the conflict between England and the Hansa. And it's just this really, it's just such a spicy time period, spicy as I say, in terms of the politics, so regional politics, international politics, a lot of piracy, a lot of decapitations. It's exciting stuff.
Well, Portinari also offers us a nice segue into the next image that we see on the screen, because that is actually a portrait of him and his wife, Maria Baroncelli, isn't it? Probably derived from a diptych in the past.
Probably, or possibly a triptych. We think that
Sorry, yes.
probably a central panel here. Probably that depicted the Madonna and Child, very traditional stuff. There's, I think, a panel in London, I think, that has been suggested as a pretty good candidate for that lost third panel. And it's much brighter than this. It's, you're a scholar of fabrics and fine things as well. The, what would you call it? Simultaneously understated and obviously rich garments here are, they're so simple and they look very, very expensive. And this, I
Yes,
was necklace, simple.
in fact, Portinari himself is dressed in sort of a mercantile attire, but his wife is actually dressed more like a noble lady than the wife of a merchant.
Well, I think this says something about the slipperiness of social class in these years. Quite a bit of scholarship about, what would you call it, the trickle-down effect of courtly, the life of the nobility and the desire for this mercantile class, especially, to have the trappings of a noble lifestyle as as a status building effect.
Portinari also sought to ingratiate himself with the court of the Dukes of Burgundy, didn't he?
He does do some hanging around at the court, seems to be placed in there as something like a middleman for selling them some very, very expensive silks and brocades, and some as almost like a cloth middleman in some ways. But you can just tell that there's this maybe a very dark purplish brown ruff or collar on this black garment.
Yes. But
And, these devotional triptychs, possibly for something like a smaller family chapel, possibly for a family chapel that was in Bruges. And so on the one hand, it's a very pious object. It's, you know, a triptych, altarpiece essentially, or some sort of a devotional work in any case. But the social and political work that it's also performing for the owners, it's gorgeous, but it's also public or semi-public. So they're able to make some implicit claims about their status.
yes.
Claims
Right.
about wealth, I suppose.
Absolutely. Well, certainly that very ornate necklace that we see. But if we look at the next image, that is again one that was destined to actually be exported to Florence, and was in this case made for a bishop, Paganotti, from the circle of the Medici, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Dominican bishop. And so definitely these Flemish painters and Netherlandish painters, they are being exported. There seems to be a bit of a craze for them in Florence especially. So some of these family chapels at places like Santa Maria Nuova and such, it would have been almost like an international exposition of Flemish art for some time, with the uh, various Medici-related chapels, especially something about visually claiming your allegiance to that. But what's interesting about this one, other than just that it's gorgeous, is some concessions that Memling's making here to Italian taste. Some of these aspects, especially these flower garlands, is the sort of flair that you see in somebody like Carlo Crivelli, or it's a very Italianate approach. It's coming from some perhaps antique origins, and the kind of thing that one of these international patrons might have specified. So
I think we see it also in the shape of the canopy above the Virgin's throne.
it is this very Italianate approach in general, right, with this round arch.
And if we talk about fabrics, one interesting thing is the brocade that we see behind the Virgin, which is a kind of a standard brocade that Memling, in different variations, used throughout his work, but which was interestingly highly likely an Italian fabric that was exported to
Some of these things coming out
to
of
Bruges and then painted by him.
So a lot of Lucchese fabrics floating around. And we see the same sort of thing in Petrus Christus and Jan van Eyck and such, especially Van Eyck.
Yes, Van Eyck started, well, we see it also with the Master of Flamand, I think. But yes, and also it has an interesting motif on the reverse of the wings, this triptych, doesn't it?
And the best explanation of this I have seen is that it relates to some sort of very classicizing erudite puns about the word for a bishop, and something about vigilance, and maybe some, what would you call it, folkloric or old sayings about storks holding stones in their beaks so that if they fall asleep, the stone drops and they wake up. So something about vigilance and bishops. So it is likely some sort of personal emblem that this particular bishop was fond of, perhaps. But and then Lawrence there, the inclusion of Lawrence, probably having something to do with this affiliation with the Medici family. So a lot
of whom Lorenzo was the head at the time.
And this beautiful inset landscape.
Yes, which is one of the things I think that Italians particularly prized Flemish painting for this landscape.
On the one hand, you do see some disparaging of the landscape tradition by the time of Michelangelo. He has some famously awful things to say about Northern landscape painting. But in these moments, it's really clear that the Italians were very interested in it and learning a lot from it. So you see quite a bit of influence of this landscape tradition in works by somebody like Perugino, and the influence of the landscape. Raphael, you find influences in, and in general, the landscape tradition, but also the portrait tradition, and somebody like Botticelli, somebody like Leonardo. They're looking very carefully at Flemish and Dutch portraits that are making it down to Italy.
Well, the Netherlandish artists do the sort of sfumato landscapes that go into blue into the distance before Leonardo does it. Though.
Yes, so which I think a lot more attention has been paid in the last quarter century or so to the influences of the North on Italy, and not just the reverse effect. So the idea that a mutual influence, in that they didn't have the same kinds of prejudices, I think, that the 20th century had. And so a lot of attention to mutuality and just the international reach of art traditions at this time, that they had enough love to send out to everybody. And that the same patrons would order commissions from a whole range of artists from different parts of Europe.
Absolutely.
And this Anatolian carpet as well. So this very distant import at that point.
Yes, that's more part of the sort of material culture that we clearly find in Bruges at the time. But I see Francois has sort of cunningly moved us to the next painting, which now we're moving to a very different national group among whom Memling also found patrons, and for whom he, in this case specifically, worked in a rather different style.
And on the other hand, this flows very naturally because it's also an example of this concession to international tastes, this flexibility about the commissions. So in this case, what we have here is these are huge. These are in Antwerp now. These maybe 3 meters wide each, very large panels from what was most likely originally a large retablo that was destined for probably a monastery in Castile, we think. So a place called Nájera. And we do know that there was a pretty large population or a large contingent of Spanish Iberian merchants from different parts of Iberia in Bruges, and any one of those people could have served as something like the middle person, the intermediary for this commission here. But it's just a handful of panels here, these 3 panels that obviously belong side by side, but they may have been something like the predella to a very large retablo, which is not a Flemish format at all. It's, like you see in Mexico City or some of the cathedrals in Spain, still these very large altarpieces with many, many panels that can be 25 feet high or larger. And this is just the remains of one of those.
Would it have been the predella, or would it have been at the top?
I think it has a predella-like form factor. And most likely above this, you would have had some very large, perhaps, Assumption of the Virgin Mary or something, and perhaps some saints. And who knows what was in the combination here. But really a shame that we just have this shred of remains of what must have been just an enormous commission. And this is done at a time in his career where they're exceptionally busy. The workshop seems to have a lot of fairly large commissions going on, and it's bound for export, but you'd want to maintain the reputation. And so something interesting that we see on that particular work is that the workshop, he would have, maybe 2 or 3 journeymen and no more than 1 or 2 apprentices at a time. And we seem to have the names of all of his apprentices, and he didn't take on many of them. But he and his assistants found a number of ways to cut costs and maybe to just expedite the process here. This was a really long project, it seems. It was delivered 20 years after the original commission, something like this. So when we get over into the right-hand panel, we find that they've made some changes to, and technical analysis pretty recently has revealed some of these facts. There was a fantastic book just about 3 or 4 years ago on this set of paintings, but they made some adjustments to how they're applying gold leaf or how they're applying silver leaf. Sometimes they just skip the gold leaf altogether, and they've worked out very clever ways to simulate the appearance of gold leaf with yellow and white paint. And just in general, they start to work much more quickly. And which something like this tells us about the economics of the workshop itself. It reflects costs of particular pigments that with an oil paint, of course, you have multiple layers of glaze, and that in some of the underlayers, they would be using a less expensive pigment for blue, like like azurite or something like this. And then only in the very top layers would they start to apply something like the ultramarine lapis lazuli, which is so hysterically expensive, and it's being imported through Venice from what's now Afghanistan. So these really distant trade routes, and we see how they're saving money, they're being economical about some of these secondary scenes that are going into this otherwise really huge retablo, and cutting corners, perhaps.
One interesting aspect there is that we were just talking about the background landscapes in the Italianate triptych, but here we do indeed have gold leaf, which for Bruges by that time must have seemed old-fashioned.
Yeah, a bit passé at that point. So and we actually find this in some works that he's doing for some German painters, some parts of Germany as well. So it seems somebody with a little bit traditional or old-fashioned tastes is making these very specific requests. And he's just a consummate businessman. And he's like, I will paint whatever you want me to, and it's going to be excellent.
Yes. Well, this is one of the very interesting aspects of his whole oeuvre, the great diversity of it.
And lastly, on that set that we were just looking at that are in Spain, a lot of attention's been given to this work by history of music scholars. The different instruments here are done with a lot of care and some significant accuracy. So music historians have actually used this as one of their sources of information about some of these instruments that you just don't find in the 20th and 21st century anymore.
And also the composition of a musical ensemble, basically, which instrument would have been playing together. And how instruments also could be used as an accompaniment to singing, because there is a continuous debate about whether singing was always a cappella or whether there was a musical.
Especially in terms of church music.
Yes, exactly.
If we could go to the left-hand panel, one thing I'd like to draw attention to is this amazing yellow color. This creamy blue, I don't know, lemon meringue color that this angel with the lute is wearing. So when you walk into the gallery in Antwerp, it just pops out at you and it just grabs you. And we were talking briefly yesterday about the hedonistic elements of some of these works, when you get a high resolution image of these and you're just able to luxuriate and just the gorgeousness of it. And I think there's been so much attention given to things like devotional aspects and religious functions and things like this, that just the fact that these are so pretty is sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, we might forget about that as art historians, indeed.
And I think maybe the excellence of reproductions in publications lately has really
helped.
made studying some of the details, like on the dalmatics and the stoles and these other liturgical garments, the details of embroidery and pearl edging and things like this. So on this dalmatic that God the Father here is wearing, for example, this is one of those spots where they've achieved this simulated gold leaf appearance with the use of the yellow and the orange paint. Look at those gems.
Yes, it does look beautiful. So Francois already kind of went a bit to the next painting, but that's also, I think, a Spanish commission.
Right.
And one that's actually a fairly recent discovery.
Yeah, a scholar named Ana Muntada Torreas has published on this in just the last 10 years or so. So this was a commission that seems to have made it down to Castile and has been just in a monastery overlooked since that time period. And the treatment of the saints, so these would have been wings of another one of these larger, at least triptychs, possibly a polyptych. and just this is what we have left now, but it's so reminiscent of the rest of Memling's work, especially some things that he was doing for these large export markets like this. And I just wanted to bring these in because it's such fresh information. So the large catalog raisonné of 1994 didn't have these, for example. So, and I think just the publication of these in the last 10 years, it's going to draw more attention to this Spanish activity of Memling's workshop. And maybe some of his students, Mikhail Sito may have been a journeyman in his workshop. That's a little bit unclear. The relationship between the workshop and Juan de Flandes and some of these other painters that make fairly respectable names under the Castilians. It's still a question of finding any kind of supporting documentation for their presence in the workshop, but something like the arrival of these in the neighborhood is tantalizing.
And we don't fully know why this particular combination of saints would have been there. I think. I mean, I think you're right about why San Bernardino of Siena, who we see here on the right, is part of it.
And a lot of this combinations of saints has to do with the particular monastery, perhaps the monarch who may have a hand in the commission, or individual priests at a particular monastery who may have wanted to have themselves and their families reflected in some way. And again, it's a question of just the lack of solid evidence in terms of the documentation. We have these amazing objects and just tiny bits of archival information that relates to them.
Tantalizing fragments.
Yes.
But yeah, you mentioned that this may well have been part of a larger polyptych, which indeed in Flanders the sort of the fashionable form was the triptych, as you already said. But also for the next work, I think that we're moving again to a different
oh yes,
background. We again have that format of the polyptych, but in this case more complete, I think.
And in this case, it's a commission that was made for, and again, the evidence here is perhaps a little bit shaky or circumstantial, but maybe a pair of brothers who were merchants who were operating out of Lubeck. So part of this Hanseatic League of cities along the northern coast and into, well, really they had offices up into what's now Russia. So Novgorod and Bergen, they had these major, what they called contours, and Bruges is another one of these sites for their offices here. But another one of these really sizable commissions. This thing is fairly large, and in this case, again, a polyptych, and it has not just the exterior view, which is the sort of view that you would see on a weekday, any given Tuesday in the year, but it has a sort of a first opening where you see different sequence of saints, and maybe for less important holidays, something like this. And then finally, there's a second opening state. So when you're trying to find images of this, it's like first opened left interior wing. It's a very complicated thing. So all of these moving, articulating parts here. But again, it's a tradition that is definitely not Flemish, but probably has something to do with some norms here of Northern Germany. This isn't such an unusual
yes.
Or even in Germany, I think the Isenheim altar is the most
exactly. It's a good example. The Isenheim altar has several wings that kind of fold open.
So it's very analogous to that. So, but again, gorgeous piece, and then another aspect of this that's intriguing is the continuous narrative of the central corpus.
Yes.
This continuous landscape that goes across all three of the fully opened states.
Well,
panel.
this is also interesting because we often tend to think that there's a sort of traditional image of the Netherlandish artists as a bit static, painting figures and portraits, the Virgin, etc. But this is actually really a narrative panel.
Mhm. And a massively narrative panel, but there's probably at least a dozen individual episodes, scenes from the Passion that are happening here. Of course, this, what they call a populist Calvary, is happening at the center with this cast of thousands. It's like one of those 1930s Hollywood films or something with all of the extras, and they've just cast everybody in this village to appear here. Where it's interesting because in Rogier van der Weyen, he's famous for these very, very stripped down, you know, crucifixions with one or two figures and this very stage-like backdrop. And here Memling just brings in everybody. And this does also seem to relate to more Germanic interests. So it's more of a tradition out in what was Memling's home country, really. This isn't something that would have been unusual to him at all. Very well known to his upbringing, likely. So kind of a feast for the eyes, all kinds of rewards for close looking as you.
Yes, because you can really trace the various stages of the Passion
and then this beautiful
throughout the landscape and
sunrise,
the
sunset scene here on the back panel where perhaps pilgrims on their way to Emmaus and the Assumption, the Ascension, and maybe the Sea of Tiberias scene on the lake in the background. And then these teeny tiny little vignettes that are showing up right along the edge of the altarpiece. And this is this continuous narrative format. This is something he had experimented with really early in his career. He did an analogous, but even more coherently unified version of this compositional approach in another work that he did for Tommaso Pordenari back in 1416.
Yeah, that one's on a single panel.
Yes. That's down in Turin, in Torino now. And in that case, single panel and even more, I think, structurally coherent. You can really make a sort of a visual itinerary across the space in a very real way through doorways and things like this. But yeah, so the polyptych and this populated Calvary does seem to have these Germanic elements. And again, so he in his workshop, taking into account specific desires of their patrons, this international clientele.
Yes. I mean, in famously in relation to the Ghirlandaio's chapel in Santa Maria Novella, where there is this contractual phrase, or there is a description of like that to pasture the eyes, basically to allow the eyes to pasture on a painting, basically. But effectively, this kind of work has the same effect, doesn't it? That you could, apart from being devotional, you can also really let your eye roam across the surface
and you just imagine it's almost like the marginalia in those illuminated manuscripts from the Gothic, where things don't change that much, and people have always been really bored in church. And so on the one hand, the luxuriousness of just the visuality of this and this real thing in the world.
But yeah, we have moved now through 3 different groups of international patrons, Italian, Spanish, German. But obviously, one of the main groups that Memling also serviced were the native Netherlandish merchants, the Netherlandish merchant community, and
Yeah.
well, this work was for one of their prominent members.
And I think one of the questions about patronage in general is that a lot of ink is given to works by identified patrons.
Hmm.
On the other hand, the majority of extant surviving panels, we don't know who the patrons were. So in some
That
way,
is true.
some of these large commissions get a lot of attention, and a lot of the smaller commissions, so the bread and butter of what the workshop production would have been, goes a bit unacknowledged or a bit unseen. And a lot of that was maybe Florentine businessmen of less funds, or especially these actual Flemish, these local, these Bruges and other parts of Flanders, these merchants and brokers that are working in the city. And some of these businessmen, they have a little bit different of professional um, a professional practice than these international traders, really, in that they are allowed some business opportunities in Bruges that are different from what, say, you could do if you were Florentine or Venetian. So the wholesale mercantilism or mercantile aspect remained in the hands of Flemings. So you couldn't sell wholesale if you were from Italy or Castile or the Hansa cities. Instead, if you did a transaction of any reasonable size, you had to go through a local broker. So a lot of Brooklings made their money by serving as brokers and essentially as middlemen for some of these foreign merchants, or as wholesalers. So Willem Morel here, for example, he's I think the closest thing that we would call it would be like a wholesale grocer or spice merchant. Of course, there was a huge amount of money in spices in these years. So here's Willem Morel and some of his sons. A couple of these families are shockingly large, so distressingly large families. But he and some of his sons on one panel, and then his wife Barbara and some of the daughters over on the other panel with her onomastic saints. So Saint Barbara, of course, there with her tower. Willem's choice of William of Malaville, I believe, is the patron saint. But these name saints, sometimes a little bit unusual. And then what Gilles and Maurus, also relating to their families. So states,
Because
families, things like this.
this panel is really, this triptych is really unusual in that it doesn't have a central virgin and child, but actually these three saints in the middle, Christopher centrally.
And Christopher, why they do have a large family. So not the largest family of Memling's patrons. Oh, there's another one, which may be commissioned by a Bruges merchant who had married a Castilian merchant, a woman from a merchant family, and they have something like 27 kids in the image, and it's terrifying.
Of later Dutch works that are slightly better documented, we know that not all the children were always necessarily alive at the time.
Some of them, well, on the other hand, you might memorialize somebody who had already passed. On the other hand, if further children are born, you could pay the artist or somebody in the workshop or somebody in a similar style to come in and append the new children in there.
Aren't some of the daughters added here in the Morel?
And Willem Morel is also an interesting character in civic politics, and which were, I think I used the word spicy earlier, so forgive me. It's very, I don't know, millennial or something. But civic politics in Bruges were wild. So every few years you would have this complete turnover of the city council, for example. And we think of this as sort of a democratic process. In those years in the 15th century, frequently this had to do with executions, and there are decapitations, and people are being exiled, and It's really the Wild West in some ways in terms of politics. And Willem Morel here is one of the burgomeesters on a number of different occasions, and he seems to be in the Duke of Burgundy's favor for some time, and then he's not, and he's exiled, and he comes back to the city and is elected mayor again, and then and the factions, I don't think, we can't really call it something like class warfare. They wouldn't have understood that in the same way that we do, but there's at least some kind of factional struggle. The factions don't look entirely natural or intuitive to us at all. And just pro-Duke factions or anti-Duke factions, and the merchants and the artisanal guilds, all of these different configurations of alliances and allegiances that are sometimes really surprising looking to us.
Well, from your story, it's evident that the factionalism significantly increased once the Valois Dukes of Burgundy had perished, and Maximilian of Austria came onto the scene.
Yeah, when the Dukes' social climb and become emperors, which is kind of intriguing in that Memling is so emblematic, I think, of his moments. He is an international, well, not a merchant, but he's an international businessman living in Bruges, this at its real peak, I would say. And his arrival and his death in 1494, which coincides just months within the inauguration of the new emperor, essentially. And it's Bruges after that moment, after 1490 or so, it will never be the same. And it kind of, he's having his flowering at the same moment that Bruges is. And then after his time, they'll still have a really significant art scene for some years, but in some ways, the real action is starting to drift off towards Antwerp in those years. Oh,
yes.
This is another one of these grocer merchants. We think he actually rented a stall space in the Holland pretty close to where Willem Morel was. And this is interesting because very similar patronage, less a successful merchant, but not as successful as Willem Morel. But it's like this tiny little thing. It's just this very small. So you see almost the same level of detail, but on such a small scale. And in this case, it's a little bit unusual because it's actually painted on walnut, which is very unusual. Almost all of the other panels are on oak. Generally, that was by far the most common support to work with at this time. Baltic oak, that of course is coming through Bruges with these Hanse merchants. So why he's chosen walnut, I can't say. Perhaps it was just in his stock. Oh, look at the little bunny behind John there. So teeny tiny bunny.
Well, an interesting aspect here is also that you have in the background behind the main donor, you have his principal name, Saint John the Baptist, but then you have two further saints hidden away in the landscape.
Joris there, or George. And we think that this might have to do with a brother who was also a merchant. So the other Joris in the family. And I think behind the rock outcropping there, that might be Maiden in Distress rather than another saint. So she might be part of this George.
That is part of the George scene, yeah. Just like the woman in the clothed in the sun is part of the St. John the Evangelist.
Or John the Disciple having this vision up in the sky. This is very similar to the much larger approach that he's taking in that more famous triptych that's in the St. John's Hospital.
Yes.
The large St. John piece. And then this Virgin Among Virgins motif here on this panel. So the Virgin Mary surrounded by these female saints, this really broad range of time, completely non-scriptural, but gorgeous here.
It's really the Virgin holding court, effectively. Ladies in waiting.
Very courtly kind of scene here, and something that's in the same years it's been appearing in Italy. So just the kind of inclusion of this approach appearing at this time, a bit more evidence of this back and forth that Bruges and Florence especially are happening in terms of artistic motifs. Yet the eyeballs there. So
yes, Saint Lucy.
Lucy's eyeballs. And Catherine receiving this ring. But again, the visual texture of the different fabrics here, something that's in the time and place. These are people who are very interested in fabrics, in textiles, and so many of them are textile merchants. There's such a major impact of the various textile producing industries, I suppose, in the area.
Yeah.
So wool production and carding and
if we think in terms of Baxendel's period eye, this is precisely what they traded in and what they knew about.
Drapery for people who know their drapery.
Exactly. Which again also leads us to the next and maybe final work of our discussion, which is another diptych made for a local well, mercantile
yeah, now
rich
this
person.
Martin van Nieuwenhove, he's perhaps 21, I think, when this diptych is created. His older brother is already very influential in politics at this moment, and that's interesting as well, in that his brother and his allies are somewhat in a different faction from Willem Morel that we just saw, and members of the family are decapitated in one of these political turnovers, but this one's just particularly gorgeous, and the spatial implications of this diptych and how it would have sat on a surface. And he's, if you turn this 33 degrees or so, he's looking across our space towards her, and which accounts for the shifting of the wall. There's something interesting happening with space here, right? In the mirror,
Yes.
that they're in the same space, which is a little bit cheeky perhaps, but they've sort of painted their way around that theological problem, I suppose. But
Well,
again,
it is quite unusual in that they do seem to be really in a domestic interior.
which is not so unusual in the Netherlands in these years, of course.
Well, it's not unusual for the Virgin, but it's unusual for the Virgin and the donor to be in the same domestic.
At least he's on another panel, so. But I love the inclusion of all of the extra information in the stained glass. And
yes, lovely.
Like
His patron saint is actually in the stained glass.
yeah, Martin's right behind him. And again, the miracles of these really high resolution reproductions that we have access to. The internet's lovely. So.
I know, it's almost better than the original painting.
But this particular portrait gets your attention. He looks so modern. He looks so much like us. He looks like perhaps he plays hockey. It looks like the kind of figure that you can really identify with.
Absolutely.
That absolutely gorgeous landscape sliver there. Just such a small part of the square meterage of the composition, and so much care taken there, and just to the ornamentation, those gems on her kirtle.
Well, on this naturalistic note, I think we should perhaps open the discussion to the audience. So I would encourage you either to send me your question via the chat, or simply to use the raise hand option, and then I'll ask you to unmute if you want to ask a question to our panel. Well, pursuing on the question of portrait, if I may ask a question, certainly Memling seems to make quite a step in terms of naturalistic portrait. and also of naturalism. And I think at the end I wanted to show you this this still life, but surely the still life is part of the portrait. It's either the reverse or the lead of the portrait. So it's not only images for the pleasure of images, it has a symbolic meaning. Would you have any comment on this aspect?
Oh, on the symbolic aspect?
Yeah, on the symbolic aspect, like how symbolism crosses reality. That's the whole problem of Panofsky, hidden symbolism, on which I'm sure Rembrandt will have some comments as well. But here we have a good example of someone praying to a vase of flowers, which some of which have, I think, obvious Marian symbolism.
What, columbines, and we have these irises and the lilies, of course, and all of these are representing traditionally different aspects of the Virgin Mary's piety and suffering and purity and these sort of aspects. But it's, I think, even this Flemish and Netherlandish art history, it's fascinating how what we will recognize as these discrete genres in the 17th century especially, and this will accelerate from about 1525 on, that those discrete genres, they really do have their origins in some of these religious paintings. So this was most likely half of a devotional diptych. So again, the flowers appears on the back of this. We don't know who this is. He's probably a Spanish merchant or maybe lesser nobility of some sort. So this would have been, just like Martin van Nieuwenhove, sitting apart or across from probably a saint, most likely the Virgin Mary. Perhaps it was part of a triptych even originally, but not likely given the form factor. But that these genres like still life, like landscape, we see the landscape obviously here really emerging as something that's definitely of interest to them. And you see, almost analogous to this, is this one of the earliest autonomous, almost still lives. There's a exterior of a triptych by Hugo van der Goes that is landscape, and there's no real clear religious content in that. It's on the exterior of a triptych, which of course there's religious content inherently in that, but within the image itself, like, what is happening here? Is this the exterior of the stable or something like this? But it's as if the painters and the clients all agree that these other subject matters are very, very interesting, and they're trying to find some way to highlight them, to smuggle them in, and start to give them their own lives in some way.
Mm. We were just looking at St. Bernard earlier, and he's also flashing the monogram of Christ. But is that vase the kind of vase that you would find in a real domestic interior, or do you think it's also an invention of the painter? And I'm sure, Rembrandt, you would have some comments on the carpet that is.
Well, you find this kind of like Majolica ware there. We find it in Van Eyck and in Hugo and in Rogier van der Weyden as well. So definitely somebody is in the north. They are importing this. There's still some examples of this kind of ceramic at the Pharmacy Museum at what is now the Memling Museum. So we have examples of this, and we know that they are importing this from Italy, from Iberia, from different spaces. And then the Anatolian carpet, that's a pretty distant importation there. And you see the same style of carpets. And so this kind of carpet has been nicknamed the Memling carpet, and there's something analogous like that with Holbein and some of these other artists that carpet historians are very interested in, because some of these Netherlandish paintings, and in some cases some Venetian painters as well, these are the earliest traces of standard designs that we have. So this is where the information is coming from on some of these pretty stock types, we think, that were being exported in these years. But
Altogether, but while it's a religious still life, it's also really a small celebration of material culture, isn't it? Precisely with all these imported.
and I don't think they had the same tension about that combination that we
No.
have. I think they were pretty comfortable in their newfound sort of bourgeois sort of lifestyle. I think, yeah, a celebration of this new approach to living. And again, something a little bit trickle down noble life for them.
I see. I don't see any question in the chat. I feel asking you an almost Warburgian question. That is, it seems that there's a way to find out when he's working for Italian patrons and when he's working for northern patrons. So he's someone who absorbed the style of the time, but who adapt them to his sense of business. Would you agree that it sums up Memling, like someone who is really attentive to the art of his time, because he has to work for the people for whom this is almost a national art. And I'm showing back the Italian thing, the Panagnotti, because not only San Lorenzo is Florentine, but of course Saint John the Baptist is the emblem of Florence. And also in this painting, I see really a contrast between the kind of Gothic framing of the saint and the much more Italianate classic of framing of the Virgin.
Yeah, in terms of him, Memling in his workshop, having this really international view. I wouldn't argue that he's probably himself extremely well traveled in the same way that perhaps Jan van Eyck or Albrecht Dürer or somebody would be. Chances are he was never in Italy, but living in Bruges in these years, it's the next best thing. It's like living in New York or something, where essentially this multinational milieu that you're operating within, and you'd have to really have your fingers on a lot of different pulses. And of course, it also speaks to the back and forth that artists and patrons would have, where you do have this opportunity for a negotiation about what saints will be included, what's your dad's name, and how many panels do you want? Really? Okay, we can do that too. You want gold leaf? I suppose. Are you sure? Okay, we can do your gold leaf. And that's the, we don't really have many written contracts in the North. Those were pretty uncommon, but it does speak to some kind of negotiation and back and forth and kind of collaborative process of determining the appearance of a work. And that just as a businessman, as a workshop, that they were so open to this kind of back and forth with clients.
No, absolutely. We tend to see artists as the individual style, but when I see these two paintings which are on the screen, I can see also the chameleon side of artists adapting to the taste of their patrons.
Well, one of the interesting things with Memling is that he manages to sort of maintain a fairly consistent brand while at the same time making all these adaptations.
And I think for a lot of these workshops in this part of the century, as a journeyman, you couldn't expect to have your own personal style. So I think individuality, creativity, that's something that we value. And as a journeyman, especially as an assistant, you would need to suppress that. There is the workshop style, and it's almost like a brand. And the client must know that they're going to get something analogous to what they've seen in their parish church that their rival merchants has commissioned, and that they'll have something that's possibly just better than that, but that it's going to have something to do with that style that they're expecting.
Thank you. Well, now I have questions in the chat. So I have two questions at the moment. The first from Catherine Havelock. Can I ask you why you think that Memling's landscape were so influential in Italy?
I think in the same years, the Italians, they have been developing their own landscape tradition. And I think just as not a novelty, but just as an alternative approach. I think the artists down there especially are very receptive to it. And I think primarily, almost because I love him, maybe, of Perugino being so receptive to this tradition. And so the Flemings, they're going to do their Flemish landscape. And it's, I think the artists in Florence especially, who are especially receptive to it, and their clients are almost following them. And I'm not sure if that's answering the question, but I think it's really the artists that are seeing something in this tradition that's very, very appealing to them. And
well, there are simply a number of features, and landscape is one prominent one that we see first in Netherlands and then starting to be adopted in Italian painting. You can determine the sequence. It's not just that they happen to do it at the same time. It's really this kind of atmospheric type landscape we actually first see in Jan van Eyck and then later other Netherlandish artists.
And Memling's, of course, not the first person to do this. And Jan van Eyck has already been working for some Italian clients, especially Genoese clients. And by the time Memling's working, there's already some sort of pipeline of Flemish into Florence, into Genoa, and into Bologna, Lucca especially, I suppose, in terms of some of these artists.
Okay. Thank you. We have more questions coming. One more question from a user. How would contemporary audience have read the musical instrument? Symbolic, but also documentary?
Possibly both. I think one of the unusual aspects of the inclusion of such a wide orchestra, I suppose, of musical instruments in one of these paintings is that in these years, that would have been infrequently experienced, especially in a devotional context, especially in a religious, ecclesiastical context. Instrumental music in the church was not common. Perhaps something like an Easter play presentation, you might have trumpets or something like this. And I think that this sort of, you have the choir, that's expected, but then these side panels of 10 different instruments or something, this would have not been normal. So this would have been something that was really exceptional and would stand out. So I think there has to be some sort of symbolic aspect to this. To us, we love it for its documentary content because it's like, oh, that's what a viol di gamba looked like in 1475, 1480. To the contemporary viewer, though, especially in that they are seeing this retablo in a cathedral or in a large church, this would have been perhaps almost like a heavenly choir, something not quite of this world. And I think the gold leaf background, which again in Flanders, that's very retro, very, very passé, but it heightens that otherworldly kind of divine music aspect to it.
Well, another aspect possibly is that obviously because this is a religious painting, we think of it as in terms of church music, but actually it might be more like a court orchestra belonging to the heavenly court. And if you went to the court of a king, he might indeed have a lot of instrumentalists and sort of livening up his party, basically.
Especially with this sort of concern for nobility and monarchy in Iberia, that might have resonated pretty strongly with them.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. We have two more questions. So one from Niklas Groszinski. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about Memling's workshop. How big was it? How much can we differentiate the masters and the workshop hands? Did his merchant patrons sometimes specify that they wanted paintings by the master's hands specifically? And thank you again.
Thanks. Yeah, in terms of what we know about the workshop, there are a few documents that name for us, for example, the identities of his apprentices. Apprentices, for some reason, are very well documented, perhaps because they're paying a tuition. So we have their names. He took on one apprentice at a time, twice that we know of. It's also entirely possible that one or more of his sons might have been assistants in the workshop as well, maybe finished some commissions after he died. But a lot of what we know about how the workshop would have operated is just from guild regulations in Bruges at that time that would have stipulated how many apprentices can you have, what are they paying. So if their parents were from Bruges, they would pay a smaller amount than if they were from out country. So how many people can be working in the workshop at a time, what mandatory holidays you have to be taking off, what days you need to show up at chapel, where you're able to sell any works that you might have produced on spec, which is a practice that's just starting to emerge in these years. So he's mostly working on commission, but it's possible that there was something produced on spec, maybe some of those smaller devotional panels that a person could drop in and say, add my coat of arms there, and I'll take 2 of them, something like that. But we do know quite a bit from the guild regulations. So he would have had probably a fairly small shop. We think maybe 2 or 3 assistants at any given time, tops. In the early 1490s, when the workshop's getting very busy with some large commissions like those panels for Iberia, for example, possibly he might have hired on a couple of extra people to help with that. But again, the workshop hand, it was expected to be uniform. We do see examples of patrons stipulating in a contract that, for example, the hands and the faces have to be done by the head of the workshop. There have been some color notations identified in some of his underdrawings, especially of the really big panels. So we know that in that case, he may have been completing something like the underdrawing, the preparatory drawing, and then having assistants paint in large swaths of colors in garments, for example. So in the panels in Antwerp that were for the large retablo, for example, we do have some underdrawn, blue goes here sort of notations there. But otherwise, the finished paint layer, the visible paint surface would need to be uniform, and any journeyman, any assistants that were working there would have to just calm down whatever natural, individualistic tendencies that they had until they got their own shop, and then they could let their freak flags fly.
One more question from Ramon D. What evidence is there in terms of correspondence, for example, of merchant patrons giving any kind of direction to the artist? Could you give us some example of preference in terms of style or subject?
In terms of Memling, what we have is mostly circumstantial, just that he's making some choices that would be unusual in Bruges for international patrons, but they're making these choices, so that just kind of stands to speak for itself. In the case of some other artists, we do know that there are a handful of contracts, from Ghent, for example, and from Brussels, some of the painters working about the same time in other places, that there would be interventions held. So especially if something was perceived going on too long or over budget. So there are a handful of contracts. I think Marion Ainsworth, I think, goes into this in some detail about bits of contracts or contract-like documents that we have surviving. In terms of Memling, the only thing that we have that really resembles anything like a contract is for altarpiece that he did for the Librarians Guild of Bruges. So this would have been book producers, vendors, manuscript illuminators, sort of that sector for their little chapel. And one of the people responsible for arranging the commission was actually Willem Vreeland, who was a manuscript painter that lived right down the street from him. And in that, what do we find? We find indication of dimensions that it should be, that they should locate a carpenter to cut panels to particular dimensions that should be probably, we think the verb that they're using is a little bit vague, but that they should be aligned with canvas as a preparatory layer, and that it should have a particular selection of saints and something about the overall expected budget. And there's just a couple of tiny documents that go back and forth, but again, there weren't at this moment really long, elaborate contracts like there are at some other times and places. And so again, with Memling, what we have is kind of just the objects themselves are the primary documentation for this.